So here's a question for you. Is being smart the same thing as having good self control? I mean, it sounds like a simple question, right? But believe it or not, this has been a massive puzzle for scientists for like over 100 years. So today, we're going to dive deep into the neuroscience to finally get a clear answer.
You know exactly what I'm talking about. We've all seen it, right? The brilliant, absolute genius who just makes a complete mess of their personal life. Or, on the flip side, that person who wasn't a straight A student but has this incredible, rock solid discipline. Well, that very common observation, it cuts right to the heart of a huge scientific debate. What is the real relationship between what we call intelligence and what neuroscientists call executive functions?
Okay, so to get to the bottom of this, we've got to define our two main characters here. And this is super important. These two ideas come from totally different worlds. Intelligence, that's a classic concept from psychology. But executive function, that's a much newer idea that came out of neuroscience. So they basically grew up in separate scientific neighborhoods, which, as you can imagine, is a big reason why everything got so tangled up.
Just take a look at how similar these classic definitions are. It's kind of wild. On one hand, you've got psychologist David Wexler, who says intelligence is the ability to act purposefully. Then you have neuroscientist Alexander Luria, who describes executive functions as a system for programming, controlling, and verifying activity. I mean, you can see the overlap right away, can't you? Acting purposefully sounds an awful lot like programming and controlling. So yeah, it's really no wonder this whole thing became such a confusing mess.
But here's where we hit our first major plot twist. Just when you think we can start comparing executive function to intelligence, bam, we run into a huge problem. Turns out, scientists couldn't even agree on what executive function is in the first place. Is it just one single thing, or is it more like a whole collection of different skills? And this disagreement basically split the research world into two main camps. You had the unity camp, who were convinced that there was one single fundamental executive function at the heart of everything. Something like, say, behavior inhibition. You know, that ability to just stop yourself from acting on an impulse. But then you had the diversity camp, and they argued that no, executive functions are more like a toolkit, a bunch of different separate skills. And this is a really crucial point, right? Because how on earth can you compare intelligence to something when nobody can even agree on its definition? Well, pretty soon the evidence started piling up, and it was really pointing towards that diversity view. For starters, researchers noticed that patients with damage to their frontal lobes would often bomb one kind of executive test, but then pass another one with flying colors. And on top of that, when they ran the numbers, they found that the scores on all these different executive function tests barely correlated with each other at all. It was all a huge clue that they weren't just measuring one single thing. So, how do we solve this puzzle? Well, this is where the research from Alfredo Ardila points to a massive breakthrough that just cuts right through all the confusion. The solution? We need to split executive functions into two totally different types. And the best way to think about it is like this. You have two different managers running things in your brain's head office. You've got a cool, super logical manager, and then you've got a hot, much more emotional one. And this table just illustrates that difference perfectly. Okay, so on the left, you've got your cool metacognitive functions. Think of this as your brain's chief strategy officer. This is the part that handles all the heavy lifting: abstract thinking, planning, problem solving, your working memory. And this manager, it works out of a specific part of your brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now on the right, you have your hot, emotional functions. This is more like your brain's HR officer. It's in charge of coordinating your thoughts with your feelings, stopping you from acting on selfish impulses, and helping you navigate tricky social situations. And this manager works out of a totally different area, the ventral and medial parts of the prefrontal cortex. So you see, two completely different jobs happening in two different parts of the brain. If you want a powerful, real-world example of this split, look no further than the classic, tragic story of Phineas Gage. Back in 1848, Gage was a railroad worker, and he had this horrific accident where an iron rod blasted right through the front of his skull. Amazingly, he survived, and his memory, his ability to reason, all his cool functions, they were pretty much intact. But his personality, it was completely changed. He became impulsive, rude, totally socially inappropriate. In our analogy, his HR officer was completely gone, even though the chief strategy officer was still sitting at its desk doing its job. And it's not just about different brain regions. This whole two-manager idea is also backed up by how we develop as kids. Check this out. Our hot, emotional functions, things like attention control, start showing up in the very first year of life. But our cool, strategic functions, things like planning and fluency, they don't really come online until we're around 3 years old, right around the time complex language develops. They're literally working on two different developmental schedules. Okay, so now that we have this fantastic two managers framework, we can finally go back to our original question. And with this new way of looking at things, that whole confusing relationship between intelligence and executive functions, it's about to snap right into focus.
And this framework? It helps solve a mystery that stumped researchers for decades. I mean, way back in the 1940s, scientists were just stunned to find that patients with really significant damage to their frontal lobes, I'm talking even people who had parts surgically removed, could still get totally normal scores on IQ tests. It made no sense. How could the brain's CEO be so badly compromised, but intelligence was still there? It was a real head-scratcher.
And this chart right here? This is basically the smoking gun. So, look at the bar on the far left for updating. That's a cool skill, kind of like working memory. See how high its correlation with IQ is? It's huge. Now look at the other two bars, inhibiting and shifting. These are hot skills, things related to impulse control. And their correlation with intelligence? It's super low, basically not significant. This is the key. Intelligence is tied to the cool manager, not the hot one. All right, so let's recap. We've defined our terms, we've waded through the scientific debates, we've looked at the evidence from brain damage, from child development, from statistical studies. We have all the pieces of the puzzle right here on the table. So let's put it all together and get our final answer.
And here it is, the core conclusion from all this analysis. Is intelligence the same as executive function? Well, the answer is kinda yes and kinda no. General intelligence, the stuff that IQ tests measure, is pretty much the same thing as our cool, thinking-based executive functions. It's our ability to plan, to reason, to solve abstract problems. But, and this is a huge but, it is not the same as our hot, emotional executive functions, the ones that handle our impulse control and social skills.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's this. Your IQ score, it's a really good measure of your brain's cool, strategic manager. Its power to plan and solve problems. But it tells you next to nothing about your hot, emotional manager. That's the part in charge of your impulse control and social savvy. And that, right there, finally explains how someone can be a certified genius and still make one terrible life decision after another. So that leaves us with a final question to chew on for you personally. Which of your brain's managers do you tend to rely on most? The cool, detached strategist, or the hot, impulsive people person? And maybe more importantly, what happens when those two managers in your head disagree? It's definitely something to think about.